The January air near Ocean Beach feels damp and metallic, with fog softening the streetlights along the western edge of San Francisco. This is where the Doodler case begins, not as a legend, but as a thin file with a name, a date, and many blank spaces. You are at a desk under a low lamp, turning pages that have been handled for decades. There are typed reports, careful notes, and questions written in the plain language of patient police work. In 1974, investigators did not have modern databases or quick forensic answers waiting nearby. They had interviews, neighborhood canvasses, bar conversations, and the slow trust of people who had reasons to stay private. The city around the case was changing, but not always safely for the men whose memories mattered. So the investigation moved quietly, one recollection at a time, toward the image of a young man with a sketchpad. And tonight, we begin with that first file, before the pattern had a name. The date written near the top is the 27th of January, 1974. The name is Gerald Earl Kavanaugh, a man in his late 40s found near the water at Ocean Beach. At first, there was no pattern to see, only the stillness of one report, one location, and one person whose last hours needed to be understood. The first concrete problem was simple and very difficult. Investigators had a man's name, a public shoreline, and very little that clearly explained how he had come to be there. So the early work began in the old way, with shoes on pavement, questions asked carefully, and notes taken in ordinary ink. Someone had to decide where to begin. You can imagine the detective standing near the edge of the scene, looking toward the dark line of the Pacific, then back toward the streets and parking areas behind him. The choice was not dramatic, it was practical. Do you treat this as an isolated death near the beach, or do you keep the file open wide enough for something not yet visible? The safer answer, in patient police work, is often to leave room. So the file stayed open. Officers checked for identification, for missing person reports, for anyone who might have seen Kavanaugh in the hours before he was found. They looked at the nearby roads, the paths, the places where a person might park, wait, meet someone, or simply walk alone in the mist. Ocean Beach was not remote, but at night it could feel separate from the city. There was the long grey spread of sand, the sound of surf, the highway, and the sense that the western edge of San Francisco belonged partly to the sea. A person could be seen there and still not be remembered. A person could pass through the fog and leave behind only a small uncertainty in someone else's mind. That was the first setback. There was no clear witness stepping forward with a complete story. There was no single object that seemed to answer the central question. There were only fragments, and in 1974, fragments had to be held carefully by people. No digital system would quietly connect names in the background. No network of cameras would build a timeline second by second. No quick forensic comparison would move the case from one desk to another with a neat result. Instead, an investigator had to write things down, preserve them, and hope that a later detail might make an earlier one meaningful. That is one of the quiet truths of cold cases. The first file often does not know it is the first file. It waits without understanding what it may become. In those first days, the city itself mattered. San Francisco in the early 1970s was a place of movement, arrival, and change. People came looking for freedom, community, work, music, anonymity, reinvention, and sometimes all of those things at once. For gay men, the city could offer connection that was harder to find elsewhere. But that connection existed beside risk and beside a long history of being watched, judged, or harmed by public exposure. This meant that a witness might know something and still hesitate. A man might have seen Kavanaugh in a bar, on a street, or speaking with someone near closing time, but saying so could bring attention to his own life. It could affect a job, it could affect a family, it could affect where he lived, who trusted him, and whether he felt safe walking home. So investigators were not only searching for facts, they were moving through fear. That changed the pace of everything. A question that might seem simple on paper could become delicate in person. Where were you that night? Who were you with? Did you see this man? Did he speak to anyone? These were police questions. But they were also personal questions, and in that time, they could carry consequences beyond the case itself. You can picture an officer entering a bar not as a movie scene, but as a slow disturbance in a room that had been trying to feel private. Glasses on tables, low voices, people glancing up, then looking away. The detective's notebook might be ready, but trust would not be ready just because a badge appeared. That became the next development in the investigation. The search for information had to pass through social territory, where official attention was not always welcome. If detectives pushed too hard, doors could close. If they asked too little, the file would remain thin, so they had to find a middle way, one conversation at a time. This is where the investigation began to take on the patience that would define it. Names were written down, addresses were checked, people were asked when they had last seen Gerald Kavanagh and whether he had seemed to be meeting anyone. The answers were partial. Some people could not help, some did not want to be recorded. Some may have remembered a face but not a name, or a night but not a date. And still, each answer mattered, because the absence of information can also shape a case. If no one remembered an argument, that said one thing. If no one remembered a known enemy, that said another. If the last known movements suggested a social meeting, then investigators had to consider the quiet spaces where men met, talked, and trusted strangers. The cause and effect was slow but clear. Because the shoreline offered few answers, detectives had to move inland. Because inland meant bars and social circles, they had to ask about private lives. Because private lives were vulnerable, they had to ask with care. And because care takes time, the case did not move quickly. It gathered weight. There is a particular feel to an old report from this period. The language is plain, the sentences are clipped, the details can seem dry until you remember that every line meant someone had gone somewhere, spoken to someone, and tried to hold a fact in place. A report might say that an area was canvassed, but behind that one word, canvassed, there are hours, there are doorways, sidewalks, parked cars, front desks, late-night employees, and people trying to remember what they saw when they did not know it mattered. A report might say that no useful information was obtained, but even that is work. It narrows the dark a little. It marks the places where the answer was not found. The investigation also had to account for movement. Ocean Beach drew many kinds of visitors. There were residents from nearby avenues. There were people driving across town. There were people leaving bars, parties, dinners, or private apartments. There were men who met casually and did not exchange full names. That kind of social world created a problem for police records. If a person was last seen with someone known only by a first name, a nickname, or a physical description, the trail could become soft very quickly. The first file began to show this softness. There was not enough to hold. There were names to verify, but not enough certainty. There were places to ask about, but no single place that opened the whole story. There were possibilities, but possibilities are not proof. So the detectives had to choose again. They could let the file drift toward the back of a drawer, as many difficult cases do when no new information arrives. Or they could preserve its questions in a way that allowed it to speak later if another event gave it context. The decision was to keep the material. That sounds modest. It was not. In a case without a clear path forward, preservation is an act of faith. You keep the notes because someone may one day remember a detail. You keep the timeline because another timeline may one day sit beside it. You keep the names because a name that means nothing in January may mean something in June. And this is how patient detective work often looks from the inside. It is not a chase. It is not a sudden arrival at certainty. It is a careful refusal to discard what has not yet explained itself. The city continued around the case. Streetcars ran. Fog came in over the western neighborhoods. Morning papers arrived on steps. The Castro, the Tenderloin, Polk Street, and other gathering places held the ordinary rhythm of lives being lived. Men met friends, went to work, found rooms, made calls, kept secrets, and tried to be known by the people they trusted. Inside that daily life, a police file sat with Gerald Kavanagh's name on it. The file did not yet have the name that would later attach to the case. There was no public shorthand, no simple label, no single image of a suspect repeated from one account to another. There was only a question near the ocean. Who had been with him? What had happened before he reached that stretch of beach? And why did the answer seem to leave so little behind? The early 1970s also shaped what could be said publicly. Newspapers could help by bringing attention to a case, but publicity could also expose people who were not ready or not safe to be connected to a gay social setting. That tension would become more important later. But even in the first file, you can feel it beginning. Investigators needed witnesses. Witnesses needed protection. The law needed names. People needed privacy. No part of that balance was simple. If you are reading the file late at night, you may notice how much of the case lives in the space between official record and personal memory. The official record wants dates, times, addresses, and statements. Memory gives impressions: a face in dim light, a jacket, a voice, a man leaving with someone, a conversation that seemed ordinary, a drawing perhaps, though that detail had not yet come into focus. At this stage, even if someone had seen something important, they may not have understood it as important. That is another difficulty in investigations like this. Witnesses do not live inside case files. They live inside ordinary evenings. They do not know which detail will matter later. They do not mark a stranger's face in memory unless something tells them to. And by the time detectives come asking, memory has already begun to soften at the edges. So the first investigation moved through soft edges. It looked for firmness where it could. A time, a location, a last known sighting, a possible companion, a reason to believe the death was connected to a meeting rather than chance. Each small point helped, but none was enough. Days passed, then weeks. The file remained active, but no clean answer arrived. This is not failure in the simple sense. It is the common weather of difficult cases. A detective can do the work properly and still not have enough. A witness can want to help and still remember too little. A community can know there is danger and still have good reasons not to trust every question asked by authority. In that way, the first file already contained the shape of the larger case. It was not only about finding one unknown person, it was about finding a way for frightened knowledge to become usable evidence. That takes more than suspicion. It takes trust, timing, and proof. The proof was not there yet. The trust was uncertain. The timing was already beginning to pass. Still, investigators continued to ask. They checked the places closest to Kavanaugh's known movements. They considered who might have met him. They looked for anyone whose account did not fit. They held open the possibility that one death by the water might later connect to another event. This was the quiet foundation. Not a solved foundation, not a satisfying one, but a foundation made of careful work, which is all investigators had. The more you sit with this first file, the more you notice its restraint. It does not know the future. It does not announce a pattern. It does not yet say that San Francisco police will later look back on Kavanaugh's case as the beginning of a series. It simply records that Gerald Kavanaugh was found near Ocean Beach in January and that people tried to learn why. There is dignity in that plainness. Before a case becomes known, before a nickname, before renewed appeals and age-progressed sketches, there is usually one person whose story is being reconstructed from traces. That person was not a symbol. He was not an entry in a list. He was Gerald Kavanaugh. And in the first days, the work was to give his final movements the seriousness they deserved. The file also shows how geography can become evidence without saying anything directly. Ocean Beach is open, but not empty. It borders neighborhoods, roads, parking areas, and the long edge of Golden Gate Park nearby. A person could arrive by car, by bus, by walking, or by meeting someone who offered a ride. The setting created possibilities faster than investigators could close them. If Kavanaugh had met someone elsewhere, the beach might only be the last known place. If he had met someone near the beach, then witnesses might be residents, drivers, walkers, or strangers who never knew they had passed through a case. Every possibility required a different path. That is where a detective's patience becomes almost physical. You do not solve the whole map. You walk one line of it, then another, then another. You check a bar because someone mentioned it. You check a rooming house because a name appears. You return to a witness because a second question forms later. You reread a sentence because something in it feels unfinished. This is the slow rhythm that surrounded the Kavanaugh file. At some point, the immediate urgency faded into a quieter persistence. That happens in nearly every investigation that does not resolve quickly. The phones ring less. The desk still holds the report, but the room around it becomes quieter. A detective may move on to other assignments, other calls, other names, while one page stays waiting in the same folder. That is not neglect. It is often how an investigation breathes when there is nothing new to do. You keep the file close enough to return to it. You keep the question alive without pretending you can force an answer. In the months after Gerald Kavanaugh was found, San Francisco kept changing around that question. Winter loosened into spring. The fog came and went. Tourists crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, workers rode buses downtown, and men continued to find one another in places where they could be themselves, at least for a little while. The case had no public shape yet. It had no name that people would repeat. It was still one man, one location, and one set of unanswered movements near the western edge of the city. But the file had begun teaching investigators something even before anyone knew it. It taught them that the case would not be solved from the shoreline alone. It would require the patient study of where people met, how they moved, and why someone might not come forward, even if they knew something important. This was the beginning of a larger lesson. In some investigations, the first piece of evidence is not a fingerprint, or a weapon, or a confession. It is a silence, not an empty silence. A human one. A silence made of caution, memory, embarrassment, fear, and the need to survive in a world that was not always kind. The investigators had to sit with that. They had to learn the boundaries of it. They had to understand that a witness who hesitated was not necessarily refusing to help. He might be measuring the cost of being seen. He might be thinking of an employer, a spouse, a landlord, a parent, or a newspaper line that could change his life. So the questions had to be asked carefully. The answers, when they came, had to be protected. And when they did not come, the absence could not simply be dismissed. It had to be understood as part of the case. By late spring, the first file was not closed in any full sense. It was simply waiting. And then June arrived. The 25th of June, 1974, brought a second name into the quiet geography of the case. Joseph Stevens was known to many as Jay. He was found near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park, not far from the long avenues and wooded paths that make the park feel like a separate city inside San Francisco. Spreckles Lake sits in the northern part of the park, a place associated with calm water, model boats, benches, trees and paths that curve out of sight. In daylight, it can feel open and ordinary. At night, it changes. The trees hold the shadows. The roadways grow sparse. A person can move from a social place to a quiet place very quickly. For investigators, the discovery near the lake did not immediately answer the Kavanaugh file, but it changed the way that file looked. One death near a public edge of the city could be treated as isolated. A second, with possible similarities, required a different kind of attention. The detectives now had to ask whether two separate reports belonged beside one another. That is a careful question. It cannot be answered by instinct alone. If you place two cases together too quickly, you may create a pattern that is not real. If you keep them apart too long, you may miss the shape of something dangerous. So investigators compared what they had. They looked at the victims. They looked at dates. They looked at possible social paths that might have brought each man into contact with someone unknown. The work was slow because the tools were slow. There was no searchable case management system that could pull every related report in seconds. There was no instant map showing clusters of behavior. There was no genetic database waiting in the background. There were reports. There were phone calls. There were memories. There were detectives reading one page, then another, and wondering whether the same hand had passed through both stories. The second file gave the first file a new kind of weight. Gerald Kavanaugh was no longer only a man found near the ocean in January. He became, in the minds of investigators, someone whose case might be part of a broader pattern. Joseph Stevens was not reduced to that pattern. He remained a person with his own life, friends, routines, and final movements. But in detective work, one case can illuminate another without erasing it. That is what began to happen. The question became larger. Who had been meeting gay men in San Francisco in the early months of 1974? Who had enough ease, charm, or ordinary confidence to begin a conversation? Who could move through bars, parks, and late-night spaces without standing out too sharply? and who had been remembered, perhaps only faintly, by people who had not yet understood what they were seeing. The investigators widened the circle. They returned to neighborhoods and social places where men gathered. They listened for recurring descriptions. They asked whether anyone had seen Joseph Stevens with a stranger. They asked whether anyone had seen Gerald Kavanaugh with someone similar. They asked the same questions in slightly different ways, because memory sometimes opens from the side rather than the front. A person may not remember a name, but he may remember a voice. He may not remember a date, but he may remember that it rained. He may not remember a full face, but he may remember a gesture, a coat, a nervous laugh, or a reason the person seemed out of place. Detectives in 1974 had to depend on those human traces. This meant they had to return to the bars. They had to return to the places that were both social and private. The Castro was becoming more visible as a gay neighborhood, though it was still in a period of formation. Polk Street had long been a gathering place. The Tenderloin had its own nightlife, its own rooms, its own rhythms, and its own risks. Men moved between these places for different reasons. Some were open about their lives, some were not. Some were local, some were visiting, some were known by first name only. That made the inquiry difficult. The police needed names that could be written down. The community often operated on trust that did not require last names. The police needed statements. The community often survived by not leaving statements behind. Each side had a reason for moving as it did, and between those reasons, the case had to make its way. You can imagine sitting across from a witness at a small table with the room half lit and the street noise soft outside the window. The witness may want to help. He may also want to know where his name will go. He may ask whether his employer will hear. He may ask whether a newspaper will print anything. He may ask whether he can speak without becoming part of a public story. These were not small concerns. In 1974, being publicly identified as gay could carry serious consequences. A person could lose work. A person could lose housing. A person could lose family ties. A person could become a target for harassment. So, when investigators asked for help, they were also asking people to take a risk. The better detectives understood that. They knew that cooperation could not always be demanded. It had to be earned. The second file made that need clearer. If Gerald Kavanaugh's case had been larger, now detectives had reason to believe that someone might be moving through a world where witnesses existed, but where many witnesses had reason to remain unnamed. The practical effect was immediate. The canvas expanded. The questions became more specific. Investigators began listening not only for where the victims had been, but for how they may have been approached. This is where the investigation started to look beyond places and toward behavior. A location can tell you where something ended. Behavior can sometimes tell you how it began. Did the unknown man start conversations easily? Did he present himself as friendly? Did he ask questions? Did he offer something that made the encounter feel safe, ordinary, even flattering? At first, these questions may have been only possibilities, but possibilities become useful when more than one person remembers the same kind of detail. That is why detectives kept asking. They asked bartenders. They asked friends. They asked acquaintances. They asked people who had seen someone leave. They asked people who had heard rumors but did not know whether rumors were safe to repeat. And in the middle of this careful listening, a repeated image began to form. Not a full picture, not yet, but a small, specific gesture. A young man, a conversation, a pencil or pen, a sketchpad. Someone who offered to draw the men he met. This detail did not solve the case. It did something quieter. It gave investigators a way to search. If the unknown man used drawing as an introduction, then he might be remembered by people who had never known his name. A man with a sketchpad can leave a different impression than a man without one. He can seem gentle. He can seem shy. He can seem artistic. He can create a reason to sit close, to look at someone's face, to talk in a focused way. The act of drawing can feel intimate without seeming threatening. That was part of what made the detail important. It suggested a social method. It suggested that the suspect may not have relied on forceful attention at first. He may have relied on patience, flattery, and the ordinary curiosity people feel when someone wants to capture their likeness on paper. Investigators had to be careful with this too. A sketchpad does not make a person guilty. Many people draw, many people talk in bars, many people use art to start conversation. But when a repeated detail appears around multiple cases, detectives mark it. They do not jump to the end. They place it in the file. They compare it. They ask about it again. And slowly, a nickname began to attach itself to the unknown man, the Doodler. It was a simple name, maybe too simple. It made the case easier to refer to, but it also risked flattening something that was painfully complex. A nickname can travel faster than evidence. It can turn a human investigation into a phrase. Still, in practical terms, it gave people a way to remember. If someone had seen a young man sketching in a bar, the name might draw that memory forward. That was the benefit. That was also the danger. Public attention could bring witnesses. It could also frighten them away. So every step into publicity had to be measured. The police and the newspapers needed the public's help. But the people who might help were often the same people most at risk from being publicly named. This tension ran through the second phase of the investigation. By the time Joseph Stevens's file was placed near Gerald Kavanaugh's, detectives could no longer treat the first case as merely isolated. The similarities were too important to ignore. But the similarities were not enough for court. They were investigative guides. They pointed, but they did not prove. That distinction matters. It is one of the quiet lines that separates suspicion from justice. An investigator may feel the edges of a pattern. A prosecutor must stand in a courtroom and prove a case beyond a reasonable doubt. Between those two places, many cold cases have stalled. The Doodler case would come to rest in that difficult space again and again. After Joseph Stevens was found, detectives had to reconstruct his movements as carefully as they could. They wanted to know where he had been seen. They wanted to know whether he had gone to bars or social spaces that overlapped with others. They wanted to know whether anyone had offered to draw him. They wanted to know if a man matching the emerging description had been near him. The answers were uneven. Some details came through, others did not. Some witnesses were cautious, some were unreachable. Some memories were uncertain because ordinary nights had turned into police questions only after time had passed. This is one of the hardest parts of an investigation built on social contact. The event begins as normal life. No one is taking notes. No one is preserving the exact hour. No one knows that a brief conversation may later become part of a citywide search. So detectives tried to build the timeline backward. They did it from receipts, routines, statements, and recollections. They did it by asking who usually met who had been absent, and who had seemed unsettled afterward. They did it by learning the patterns of places they did not necessarily belong to themselves. That required humility. A detective entering a gay bar in 1974 could not assume he understood the room. He had to listen. He had to recognize codes, habits, and hesitations. He had to know that some people used chosen names. He had to know that a person might be out in one part of life and hidden in another. He had to know that the truth might come only if the witness believed the truth would not be used against him. That is a very particular form of police work. It is not only about extracting information, it is about making space for information to become safe enough to speak. The second file forced investigators into that space. It also made them look again at the first file with new eyes. They may have gone back over Kavanaugh's known contacts. They may have rechecked names that seemed peripheral. They may have asked whether anyone remembered a young black man, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s, who drew or offered sketches. Descriptions in cases like this are always fragile. Lighting changes, alcohol affects memory, fear shapes memory, time smooths edges away. But across accounts, investigators began to hear a general description repeated. A young black man, polite, or at least able to appear approachable. Someone who may have moved through gay social settings without raising immediate alarm. Someone connected by witness memory with the offer of a drawing. No single description could carry the case, but multiple statements could create an outline. And an outline is where investigators often begin. They fill it slowly. They test it against facts. They remove what does not hold. They keep what repeats. They wait. The waiting was not passive. It involved phone calls, interviews, and quiet returns to places already visited. It involved checking whether similar reports existed elsewhere in the city. It involved asking whether assaults had occurred but had not been formally reported. That last question mattered deeply. In a community with reason to distrust police, not every incident would become a police report. Some men may have gone home shaken and told no one official. Some may have told a friend. Some may have avoided hospitals. Some may have thought reporting would only bring more harm. If the unknown man had approached others, the trail might exist mostly in private warnings. A friend telling a friend, "Be careful." A bartender watching more closely after hearing a rumor. A man choosing not to return to a place for reasons he did not explain. Detectives had to reach into that private network without tearing it. It was delicate work. The second file changed the case, but not with a single dramatic discovery. It changed the case by shifting the frame. The first question had been, what happened to Gerald Kavanaugh? The new question became, who might be moving through this part of San Francisco, meeting men in similar ways, and leaving behind only partial memories? That question carried investigators into the summer. The city in summer could feel bright by day and hidden by night. Fog still came in. The streets could be crowded, then suddenly quiet. A bar could be full of voices at midnight, then nearly empty an hour later. People came and went. Names were exchanged. Sometimes they were not. A man with a sketchpad could be seen, remembered briefly, and then folded back into the ordinary traffic of a night out. That was the environment detectives were trying to search. And because the environment was social rather than fixed, the investigation depended on people who had no training as witnesses. They were being asked to notice what they had not known to notice. They were being asked to remember a man who may have seemed harmless. They were being asked to speak to police about places they may not have wanted police to enter. So the file grew slowly. A description here, a possible sighting there, a name that might have been used, a rumor about someone who drew portraits, a bartender who had seen a young man lingering, a patron who remembered being approached. None of it was simple, but the outline continued to form. Then, in July of 1974, another file entered the same quiet corridor. Klaus Christmann was found near Ocean Beach. The date was the 7th of July. The location brought investigators back toward the western edge of the city, back toward the fog, the surf, the parking areas, the sense of public space becoming private after dark. Christmann's case deepened the concern that had begun with Kavanaugh and Stevens. Now the investigators were not looking at 2 points. They were looking at 3. 3 does not prove everything, but it changes how the mind works. With 1 case, you search for the person involved. With 2 cases, you compare. With 3, you begin to ask whether the same person has created a pattern that will continue unless stopped. That is a heavy question. It does not need dramatic language. It is heavy enough in plain words. The detectives had another man's name, another set of last movements, and another place to search. They also had a growing responsibility to warn without causing panic. The gay community in San Francisco already lived with many pressures. There were social pressures, legal pressures, employment pressures, and the daily calculation of who could know the truth about one's life. There was also the pressure of being misunderstood by the very institutions meant to offer protection. A man could want a dangerous person found and still fear what would happen if his name appeared in a police report. That is one of the central difficulties of the Doodler case. The evidence did not sit only in objects. It sat in people, and people had lives to protect. After Klaus Christmann's death, the investigation had to become more public, but not careless. Detectives needed to reach men who might have seen the same stranger, yet they also knew that public exposure could cause harm. A newspaper notice might bring 1 witness forward. It might also send 10 others deeper into silence. So the language had to be measured, the warning had to be clear, but not cruel. The community had to understand that the danger might be connected to bars, late-night meetings, and men who accepted a stranger's invitation to talk. But the warning could not turn those ordinary parts of life into blame. That distinction mattered. It still matters. A person meeting someone at night is not responsible for being harmed. A person trusting a friendly stranger is not responsible for the stranger's choices. In a careful investigation, that truth has to remain near the center of the file. By July, investigators were listening closely for the Sketchpad detail. It was no longer just an unusual memory from one person. It had become a small landmark in the fog. A man who offered to draw portraits might be remembered by bartenders. He might be remembered by patrons who had been flattered by the offer. He might be remembered because he carried paper or because he spent time looking at faces. And if he moved between bars, that habit might follow him. It gave detectives something specific to ask. Not only did you see a stranger, not only did you notice anyone unusual, but did anyone offer to sketch you? Did you see a young man drawing in the corner? Did someone use art as a way to start a conversation? These questions were quieter than an accusation. They allowed memory to search for an image, a pencil in hand, a page resting on a table, a face being studied, a stranger leaning close enough to draw, but not close enough to alarm. That was the practical value of the nickname. The Doodler was not a solution. It was a handle on a difficult file. It gave witnesses a phrase to attach to a half-remembered encounter. It gave investigators a behavioral clue, and in a case with little else, behavior could matter. But detectives still had to separate rumor from fact. Once a nickname reaches the public, memories can change. People may begin to remember what they have heard described. They may fold newspaper details into their own recollections without meaning to. That is not dishonesty. It is how memory works. So investigators had to ask careful follow-up questions. When did you first remember the sketchpad? Did you see it yourself? Did someone tell you about it? Where were you standing? What light was in the room? What did the man say? Was there a drawing left behind? Was there a name signed on the page? Each question tried to keep the memory anchored. Without anchors, a description can drift. The emerging description was still broad. The suspect was described as a young black man, often placed in his late teens or early 20s at the time. Some accounts suggested he was slender, some suggested he was quiet, or polite, or gentle in the way he approached people. Some placed him in bars connected to gay nightlife, including places in the Castro, the Tenderloin, and areas where men moved between public and private spaces. But every description had to be treated with care. A witness might remember age poorly. Lighting could change skin tone, height, and clothing. Fear could make a person focus on one feature and miss another. Time could soften the exact shape of a face, so the description became a working outline, not a final picture. Investigators could compare accounts against it. They could show sketches. They could ask whether someone resembled the man, but resemblance alone was not proof. That line would become painful later. For now, in the summer of 1974, the main task was to gather names, gather statements, gather places, gather sketches, gather every small report of a young man who introduced himself through drawing. The files began to connect in ways that were still incomplete. Gerald Kavanaugh, near Ocean Beach in January. Joseph Stevens, near Spreckles Lake in June. Klaus Christman, near Ocean Beach in July. 3 names, 3 sets of loved ones, 3 investigations now leaning toward one another. And around them, a city full of people deciding what they could safely say. Klaus Christman's case brought its own details. He was a German immigrant, a man with a life that crossed countries and communities. Some reporting from the time described personal items and documents that suggested connections to both family life and private identity. For detectives, that kind of information mattered because it showed how complicated a person's public and private worlds could be. A man might be known one way at work. He might be known another way among friends. He might have obligations, relationships, and secrets that did not fit neatly into one official sentence. The investigation had to move through that complexity without reducing him to it. Christman was not just a link in a sequence. He was a person whose last movements deserved the same patient reconstruction as the others. Where had he been? Whom had he spoken with? Was there any witness who had seen him with a young man offering to draw? Was the Ocean Beach location meaningful or only convenient? Was there overlap with Kavanaugh's case beyond the geography? Every question created a task. Every task required someone to do it. You can picture the files side by side now, not stacked in a dramatic heap, but laid out carefully. One folder is open to a timeline, another to witness statements, another to a map. The detective moves a finger from one date to another, and then to a street name. Nothing moves quickly. Still, the shape is changing. The first two cases made comparison necessary. The third made the pattern harder to ignore. But even when a pattern becomes visible, law still asks for particulars. Who saw him? What did he say? What can be verified? What can be presented in court? The answer, in that summer, remained frustratingly incomplete. Public attention increased, but it did not fall evenly. Some newspapers reported the deaths. Some community papers and word-of-mouth networks carried warnings in ways that felt closer to the people most affected. In bars, the talk may have been low and direct. Be careful with strangers. Do not leave alone if something feels wrong. Watch for a man with a sketchpad. Tell someone where you are going. These warnings were practical. They were also heavy. They asked people to be alert in places where they had come to relax. They turned ordinary flirtation into something that had to be weighed. And yet, the warnings may have helped. They may have caused someone to step back from a conversation. They may have caused a bartender to pay attention. They may have caused a friend to remember a face. Investigators would not always know what prevention looked like. A harm avoided rarely becomes a report. It remains invisible. Still, the purpose of public warning is often to create those invisible outcomes. The case file records what happened. The community remembers what almost happened. That difference matters. Around this time, survivor accounts became especially important. These were not only rumors. There were men who had encountered someone believed to be similar and who lived to describe him. Their accounts gave investigators something rare in the Doodler case. Not only aftermath, not only last movements, but living memory of an approach, a conversation, and a face. That kind of witness can change an investigation. It can give police a direction sharper than geography. It can turn an unknown figure into someone who has a voice, a manner, and a way of gaining trust. But the same witnesses also brought the hardest barrier in the case. Some could not or would not testify publicly. Their reasons were not casual. They were rooted in the world they lived in. A man might be prominent in business. A man might be known in entertainment. A man might hold a position where public association with gay bars could end a career. A man might be married, or closeted, or connected to institutions that would not protect him. A man might simply be afraid, not afraid in an abstract way. Afraid of losing home, family, work, safety, and the life he had built. That fear could keep a witness from standing in a courtroom. And without witnesses willing to stand, a case can remain just out of reach. This is one of the most difficult parts of the Doodler investigation to sit with. The police may have had people who could identify a suspect. They may have had accounts strong enough to narrow their attention. They may have had a name. But a name held privately is not the same thing as a conviction. A witness statement, kept confidential, is not always enough to prosecute. The justice system needs evidence that can be challenged, tested, and presented. That protects the accused from weak cases. It also means that some true information never becomes usable in court. The Doodler file lived inside that conflict. Imagine you are the detective receiving one of those survivor accounts. You listen to a man describe a stranger who seemed friendly. Maybe he mentions the drawing. Maybe he remembers a bar, a conversation, a ride, a quiet shift in the tone of the evening. He may speak carefully. He may avoid certain names. He may ask that his own name not be written too openly. He may say that he wants the person stopped. Then he may say he cannot appear in court. As the detective, you understand why. As the detective, you also know what that refusal costs. The file becomes stronger in your mind, but not strong enough in law. That is a hard place to work from. It asks for patience without promising reward. You go back to the same witness later. You ask again gently. You explain what the case needs. You offer discretion where you can. You may arrange an interview away from the station. You may keep names out of public conversation. You may promise what the law allows you to promise, but you cannot erase the social cost the witness fears. You cannot make 1974 safer than it is. So the investigation develops a strange shape. The outline of the suspect grows clearer. The ability to act on that outline does not grow at the same pace. That is the central tension. Knowledge increases. Proof does not. The survivor accounts also created an investigative duty to compare. If several men described a similar person, detectives had to ask whether they were describing the same individual. They had to examine the details that matched and the details that did not. One witness might say the man was talkative, another might say he was reserved. One might place him in one neighborhood, another might place him somewhere else entirely. Those differences did not automatically break the pattern. People behave differently with different people. Witnesses remember differently. Settings change. Still, every inconsistency had to be examined. A good investigation does not keep only the facts that fit, it keeps the uncomfortable facts too. It asks whether the suspect description has become too broad. It asks whether more than one man might have used a similar approach. It asks whether fear and publicity have shaped the accounts. It asks whether an innocent person could be drawn into suspicion by coincidence. These questions slow the work. They also protect it. Patient detective work is not only patient with delay, it is patient with uncertainty. It refuses to make the case simpler than it is. By late 1974, detectives had a set of connected concerns. There were the deaths of Kavanaugh, Stevens, and Chrisman. There were reports of a sketching approach. There were descriptions of a young black man moving through social spaces connected to gay men. There were survivors who appeared to have encountered someone similar. There were witnesses who feared exposure. And there was a city learning to say the name Doodler, even though the name solved nothing. The case had become public enough to be known. It had not become public enough to be complete. That difference matters. Public awareness can make a case feel more advanced than it is. People hear a nickname, a suspect description, and a pattern, and they assume the center is solid. But inside the file, the center may still be missing. There may be no physical evidence strong enough. There may be no signed drawing. There may be no clear record of the suspect's exact movements. There may be no witness ready to speak under oath. The public sees the outline. The detective sees the empty spaces. Those empty spaces shaped the months that followed. Investigators continued searching for the person behind the drawing approach. They looked at names offered by witnesses. They compared the suspect description against known individuals. They considered men who spent time in the relevant bars. They asked whether anyone had been seen drawing portraits regularly. They listened for someone who disappeared from a scene after attention increased. They listened for someone who seemed nervous when the case was mentioned. But these are subtle indicators. They can point toward a suspect. They can also mislead. A person may leave a neighborhood for unrelated reasons. A person may be nervous around police for reasons unrelated to guilt. A person may resemble a sketch and have done nothing at all. So detectives had to build more than a feeling. They needed a case that could survive contact with court. That meant corroboration. It meant timelines. It meant witnesses. It meant evidence that did not depend entirely on one frightened memory. And that was where the investigation struggled. The Doodler case was not only evidence poor because of the era, it was evidence poor because its central interactions may have been private, brief, and socially hidden. The suspect, if he used charm or art, may have entered people's lives through consent and conversation. He may have chosen settings where no one kept records. He may have relied on the fact that men did not always tell others where they were going. He may have relied on shame that did not belong to the victims, but was placed on them by the larger world. That social silence became part of the crime's cover, not because the community did not care, because the community had been taught for many years that visibility could be dangerous. That is why the case cannot be understood only as a police mystery. It is also a history of what fear does to evidence. Fear delays reports. Fear changes statements. Fear keeps names out of newspapers. Fear keeps witnesses out of courtrooms. And when enough fear gathers around a case, the file can remain open for decades. The winter after Chrisman's death brought no clean resolution. The investigation remained active, but each week made the earliest memories older. Witnesses moved. Bars changed staff. People forgot the order of nights. A face that had once seemed clear became harder to describe. The detectives were working against time, even before the case became cold. That is one reason early cooperation matters so much in investigations. The first days are when memory is closest to the event. But in the Doodler case, those first days often collided with fear. So the most valuable information sometimes came slowly. Slow information can still matter, but it arrives with a cost. A witness who waits may remember less. A bartender who hears a rumor secondhand may not know its source. A friend who wants to protect someone may omit a name that detectives need. The file thickens, but not always in the way prosecutors need. It becomes rich with human caution. It becomes poor in courtroom certainty. This is where the story begins to shift toward 1975. The police were no longer facing a sudden unknown situation. They had a working theory. They had a nickname. They had a pattern. They had possible survivor accounts. And still, another name would enter the file. Frederick Elmer Capin was found in May of 1975. He was known as a veteran, a man who had served as a nurse during the Vietnam War. That detail has often been repeated because it reminds us that victims are never only victims. They have histories, skills, and years of service behind them. Capin had lived a life before his name entered this case. He had done work that involved care. He had existed in many rooms that had nothing to do with police reports. When his case was added to the investigation, it deepened the pattern again. The location, like others, connected back to the western side of San Francisco and the parkland and shoreline areas where the earlier cases had gathered. Investigators now had to ask whether the same person had continued. That question would have felt heavy, but familiar. By then, the detectives knew the kind of work required. They returned to timelines. They returned to bars. They returned to witness statements. They asked who had last seen Capin. They asked whether he had been with anyone. They asked whether the Sketchpad detail appeared again. They asked whether a young man matching the earlier description had been present. The repetition of the work can sound dull. It was not dull to the people doing it. It was the only way forward. A case like this moves by comparison. One report beside another. One witness beside another. One map point beside another. You look for overlap. You look for a repeated path. You look for the one detail that appears too often to be chance. But overlap is not the same as identity. A city can produce coincidences. A neighborhood can hold many men of similar age and appearance. So the comparison had to be disciplined. It had to move slowly enough to avoid making the wrong person fit the outline. In Frederick Capin's case, investigators had another life to reconstruct from pieces. They looked at his service record, his friends, his routines, and the places he was known to go. They asked whether he had crossed the same social paths as the earlier victims. They asked whether anyone had seen him with a man who drew portraits. They asked whether the suspect, if it was the same person, had changed his habits after the warnings. That last question mattered, because offenders sometimes adjust when they know police are listening. A man who had once carried a sketchpad openly might become more careful. A man who had once approached in one bar might try another neighborhood. A man who had once relied on anonymity might begin testing whether people had noticed him. But those are only possibilities, and possibilities must be treated gently. Detectives could not build a case from imagination. They needed facts that could be checked. They needed someone who had seen something, heard something, kept something, or remembered something clearly enough to help. The Capin file also reminded investigators that public warning had not ended the danger. That realization can change the mood of a police room, not with shouting, not with drama, more like a quiet tightening. The case had continued across seasons. January had become June, June had become July, and then another year had arrived. The pattern, if it was a pattern, had survived time. That meant the investigation could not simply wait for chance. It had to press, carefully, into the small places where chance might be helped along. So detectives kept returning to the social method. The drawing mattered because it was repeatable. The locations mattered because they formed a geography. The victim profiles mattered because they suggested who the suspect may have sought out. The survivor accounts mattered because they gave the unknown man a living shape. Together, these things did not yet make a case, but they gave police a direction. And direction, in a difficult investigation, can be precious. By then, the composite sketches had become part of the work. A sketch is never a photograph. It is a conversation turned into lines. A witness describes a jaw, a brow, a mouth, an expression, and an artist tries to translate memory onto paper. The result can help. It can also mislead if people treat it as exact. Investigators knew this. They used sketches as tools, not as verdicts. A bartender might look at the drawing and say, "Yes, I've seen someone like that." A patron might hesitate and say, "Maybe, but I'm not sure. Another person might say, no, the man I remember was older, or shorter, or had different hair. Each answer had to be recorded. Each answer shifted the outline slightly. The sketch became another object in the file, not the center, not the solution, just one more way to ask the city to remember. The press reports from that time carried the nickname Outward. The Doodler became a phrase people recognized. It was short, strange, and easy to repeat. But behind that name were men whose names mattered more. Gerald Kavanagh, Joseph Stevens, Klaus Christmann, Frederick Capin. Each file had its own paperwork, its own grief, and its own unfinished questions. The nickname helped the public connect the cases. It also risked turning the suspect into the story. Detectives could not afford that. They had to keep returning to the victim's movements, because that is where evidence might still live. Where did each man go before the last known point? Who saw him there? What time was it? Was he alone? Did he mention meeting someone? Did someone later seem unusually interested in the investigation? These were plain questions. They were also the only questions that could move the file toward proof. In the spring and early summer of 1975, the police were also working with the problem of delay. A person interviewed months after an event may want to help, but the mind does not store every hour equally. A witness may remember the shape of a night, but not the order of it. He may remember a drawing, but not where the paper went. He may remember the suspect's face, but not the name he gave. He may remember being uncomfortable, and still not remember why. That kind of memory is human. It is not useless. It just has to be handled honestly. Detectives had to separate confidence from accuracy. A very confident witness can be wrong. A hesitant witness can be right. A partial memory can lead to a real name if it is matched with another partial memory. So the work became a kind of careful weaving. One strand from a bartender, one strand from a survivor, one strand from a friend, one strand from a patrol officer's note, one strand from a newspaper appeal. The weave was not tight enough, but it was forming. Then came another name. Harold Gullberg was found in June of 1975. He was older than the other confirmed victims, a Swedish immigrant, and he had been living with difficulties that placed him at the edges of public attention. His case was connected by investigators to the same broader pattern, though the details brought their own uncertainties. He was found near the Lincoln Park area, close to the city's western shoreline and parkland. Again, the geography mattered. Again, the city's edge seemed to appear in the file. Ocean, park, paths, roads, and the places where a person could be both visible and alone. For detectives, Gullberg's case expanded the suspected victim count to 5. 5 is a number that changes a case. It changes how supervisors look at it. It changes how the press writes about it. It changes how a community hears warnings. It also changes how detectives carry the work home with them, because by 5 names, the file is no longer a hard case. It is a long burden. The Gullberg file raised the same practical tasks. Identify last known movements. Check contacts. Search for witnesses. Compare the details with the earlier cases. Look again at the suspect description. Ask whether the drawing approach appeared. Ask whether any surviving witness could place the same man near Gullberg or near one of the earlier victims. But with every new file, the investigation also grew more complex. More names meant more possible intersections. More locations meant more maps. More witness statements meant more contradictions to examine. And more public attention meant more tips. Some useful, some mistaken, some sincere but wrong. This is another part of patient police work that is rarely simple. A tip line can become both a help and a burden. Someone calls because a neighbor looks like the sketch. Someone calls because a coworker draws portraits. Someone calls because a man once made him uneasy in a bar. Someone calls because he heard a rumor from another person who heard it from someone else. Every tip has to be triaged. Some are checked quickly. Some require interviews. Some lead nowhere. Some create new names that must be cleared. And a few, sometimes, return the investigators to a detail they have seen before. Those are the ones that keep a detective reading. By the middle of 1975, the outline of the suspect had narrowed enough that police began focusing on particular individuals. This was not a sudden moment. It was the result of accumulated work, composite sketches, bar canvases, survivor accounts, descriptions repeated across settings, names passed quietly from one person to another, a possible connection to the same social world. At some point, these separate pieces led investigators toward a man they believed deserved direct attention. Reports over the years have described him as a young black man, fitting the general description, and known to police during the investigation. Some accounts have said he lived outside San Francisco, in the East Bay. Some have said he had been connected to psychiatric treatment. Some have said he was interviewed and the police believed they had found their suspect, but belief is not the same as a charge. And the space between belief and charge is where the Doodler case became fixed. Imagine the interview room without harsh light, without raised voices, without the shape of television drama. There is a table. There are chairs. There is a file. There are detectives who have spent months gathering fragments. There is a suspect whose face may resemble a sketch. There are questions about bars, drawings, victims, dates, and locations. There may be denials. There may be partial answers. There may be silence. What matters, for the law, is what can be proved afterward. Did the suspect admit anything that could be used? Could his movements be placed near the victims? Could witnesses identify him? Could evidence connect him to a scene? Could prosecutors take the file into court and survive the first serious challenge? Those are plain questions. They are also unforgiving. A case can feel strong in a detective's memory and still be weak in a courtroom. The district attorney's problem was not hard to explain, even if it was painful. Suspicion was not enough. A resemblance to a sketch was not enough. Private witness confidence was not enough. If the witnesses could not be presented and questioned, the prosecutor needed evidence that could stand in public. That meant testimony. That meant corroboration. That meant physical evidence, or a confession, or a chain of facts that could not easily be explained away. The Doodler case, by then, had something close to an outline. But an outline cannot be cross-examined. It cannot answer for gaps. It cannot replace a witness who is too afraid to testify. So the case stalled at the very point where it seemed closest to movement. That is one of the deepest frustrations in the file. Investigators may have believed they knew the man. They may have seen him clearly enough to feel the nearness of an answer, but the case could not hold him. The survivor witnesses were central to that difficulty. Later reporting has described them in careful terms: a diplomat, an entertainer, a man known in society or connected to public life. The exact identities were protected because the harm of exposure was real. These were men who, according to accounts, may have been able to identify the suspect, but they were not willing or not able to testify openly. Their reasons were bound to the time. A public courtroom could reveal more than a witness wished to reveal. It could place his name in newspapers. It could make his private life a public fact. It could damage a career, a marriage, a family, or a reputation built under pressure. It could also bring personal danger. So the case met a wall, built not from indifference, but from self-protection. That distinction is important. The witnesses were not simply withholding help. They were living in a world that had made honesty costly. For detectives, this created an almost impossible balance. They needed to persuade but not coerce. They needed to protect witnesses but also prepare for court. They needed to respect privacy while knowing that privacy might prevent a conviction. They could return to the same men gently. They could explain what was at stake. They could offer discretion. They could ask whether a private identification could become a formal statement. They could ask whether testimony might be sealed, limited, or handled with care. But there were limits to what anyone could promise. Courtrooms are public by design. Defense attorneys have the right to challenge the evidence. A witness's identity and credibility matter. That structure protects justice. It also means that some frightened truths remain outside the reach of prosecution. The Doodler case became a lesson in that hard fact. There is a phrase investigators sometimes use when a file has a suspect but not enough evidence. They may say the case is cleared in their mind, but not cleared by law. It is not an official resolution. It is not justice. It is a private kind of certainty, or near certainty, that cannot be made public in the way a court requires. The Doodler case has often been described in that uncomfortable space. A suspect was questioned, police attention narrowed, yet no charges followed. And because no charges followed, the man remained legally unproven. That matters too. A calm retelling has to hold both sides. The victims deserve answers. The witnesses deserve compassion. The suspect, without a conviction, remains a person who cannot be named as guilty by the file alone. The law asks for more than belief, because belief can be wrong. And in this case, the more was missing. The practical consequence was quiet and severe. Police could not move the case cleanly into prosecution. The public could be warned. The file could be maintained. The suspect could remain known to investigators. But the machinery of court did not begin. No trial tested the evidence. No jury heard the witnesses. No verdict gave the city a formal answer. The case stayed open. And open cases have their own kind of weather. At first, the work continues with urgency. Then the urgency becomes routine. Then the routine is interrupted by new tips, new comparisons, new doubts. Then, slowly, the daily assignment begins to change. Detectives take other cases, supervisors move, witnesses leave the city, bars close, paper ages, memory loosens, the file remains but the world around it does not. In 1976, San Francisco itself was changing rapidly. The gay community was becoming more politically visible. Neighborhoods were organizing. Activists were demanding protection, dignity, and recognition. Police relationships with gay residents were complicated, sometimes strained, sometimes improving through individual effort and community pressure. The Doodler case sat inside that changing relationship. It showed why trust mattered. It also showed how badly trust had been damaged before many detectives ever opened the file. A witness deciding whether to speak was not only deciding about one interview, he was deciding against years of history. He was deciding whether a police report would protect him or expose him. He was deciding whether his own life could survive becoming evidence. That is a great deal to ask of anyone, and in the Doodler case, it was asked again and again. For investigators, the work became both outward and inward. Outward meant continued interviews, continued checks, continued appeals. Inward meant reviewing the file for weaknesses. What would a defense attorney attack? Which witness statements were too vague? Which identifications were uncertain? Which timelines had gaps? Which physical evidence had been collected, and under what conditions? Could anything be retested? Could any drawing be found? Could any item be tied to the suspect? Could the suspect's known movements be matched to dates? Could another witness be found who had less to lose? Every question was a search for something stable. Every answer seemed to come back partially formed. The case also carried the limits of forensic science in that era. In the mid-1970s, investigators did not think in terms of genetic profiles the way later cold case detectives would. Evidence collection standards were different. Storage practices were different. The idea that a tiny biological trace might identify someone decades later had not yet reshaped police work. So if evidence was collected, it may not have been collected with future DNA testing in mind. If items were stored, they may have been stored under conditions that later scientists would find difficult. If evidence was not kept, it cannot be recovered by wishing. Cold cases often live with that loss. Not always because someone was careless. Sometimes because the future had not yet taught the past what to save. That is one reason the Doodler file remained dependent on witnesses. The case was built around encounters, around conversations, around bars, around a young man who may have approached with paper and pencil, around men who may have accepted a conversation because it seemed ordinary. Those things do not always leave durable traces. They live in memory. They live in the way a bartender says, "Yes, I saw him before." They live in the way a survivor closes his eyes and tries to remember a face. They live in a friend saying, "He mentioned meeting someone who drew." And when memory is the main evidence, time becomes both enemy and test. The details that survive longest may be meaningful, or they may be the details repeated most often by newspapers. Detectives had to know the difference. By the late 1970s, the Doodler investigation no longer moved with the same daily force as it had in its earliest years. That does not mean it was forgotten. It means it entered a slower phase, the phase of follow-up when a new name came in, the phase of looking again when someone called from another city, the phase of retired officers remembering a suspect they could not charge, the phase of files being kept because closing them would feel untrue. There is a quiet discipline in that kind of persistence. It does not make headlines. It does not offer comfort. But it keeps a door from shutting completely. You can picture the physical file during those years: typed pages, carbon copies, interview summaries, maps marked by hand, composite sketches softened by handling, newspaper clippings turning pale at the edges, evidence logs with item numbers and initials, names written carefully, sometimes with caution, because a name could still harm the living. There may have been notes about witnesses who would speak only privately. Others may have described a suspect, but asked that their names stay behind a curtain. That curtain was not a metaphor to the people inside the case. It was a practical protection, a way to give information without letting the information consume the rest of a life. In the late 1970s, the file began to acquire another kind of record, one that belongs to cold cases more than active ones. There were notes about who had retired. There were notes about who had moved. There were reminders that one witness could only be contacted through another person. There were margins where a detective might write, "Check again," or "No answer," or "Moved, address unknown." These are small phrases, but they tell you how time works on an investigation. Time does not close a case in one clean motion. It loosens it. A phone number stops working, a bar changes owners, a building becomes something else. A person who once knew a victim's routine leaves the city and starts over under a different sky. By then, San Francisco had also changed in ways that mattered. The gay community had become more visible, more organized, and more politically present. Harvey Milk's election to the Board of Supervisors in 1977 marked a deep change in the city's public life. It did not make the old fears vanish, but it showed that the world around those fears was shifting. For investigators, that shift mattered because a community that felt stronger might speak differently. A witness who had been silent in 1974 might, in another decade, feel less alone. A person who had hidden a memory might one day decide that the danger of speaking had become smaller than the burden of carrying it. That was the hope. It was not a simple hope. The late 1970s also brought grief, conflict, and distrust in other forms. San Francisco's history did not move in a straight line towards safety. No city does. Still, the Doodler file remained inside the long change of public life, and that change could alter what witnesses believed was possible. Cold case work often depends on changes like that. A file may wait for science. It may wait for a witness. It may wait for a change in law, culture, or courage. It may wait for a family member to open a box after someone dies and find a note that had been kept too long. It may wait for someone to realize that what they once dismissed as gossip was actually part of a pattern. In the Doodler case, the waiting was not empty. It was filled with the possibility that the city itself might become more able to remember. But as the 1970s ended, the case remained unresolved. The known suspect had not been charged. The witnesses who mattered most had not become public witnesses. The physical record did not produce the kind of proof prosecutors needed. So the file entered the next decade with its questions intact. The 1980s changed San Francisco again. The city became a place of activism, mourning, medical crisis, and community care during the AIDS epidemic. Many people who had survived the 1970s did not survive the years that followed. That fact matters quietly in this case. Witnesses may have died, friends of victims may have died, people who knew bars, routines, names, and faces may have been lost before anyone could ask them again. The epidemic did not belong to the Doodler investigation, but it affected the world that held its memories. When cold case detectives later opened old files, they were not only dealing with time, they were dealing with a generation that had carried too much loss. A name in a 1974 report might lead nowhere because the person was gone. A bartender who remembered everyone might no longer be alive to answer questions. A friend who once protected a secret might have taken that secret with him. This is one of the quiet costs that does not appear neatly in evidence logs. A cold case does not freeze the world around it. The world keeps moving. People age, disappear, recover, forget, forgive, and die. The file stays the same on paper, but the living archive around it changes every year. In that way, the Doodler case became harder and more important at the same time. Harder because the direct path to testimony grew narrower. More important because the case held a record of men whose lives had been pushed toward the margins. To keep the file open was to say that their names still mattered. It was to say that fear in 1974 should not be allowed to erase them. It was to say that even if the law had not reached a verdict, the effort to understand should continue. That kind of persistence can look modest from the outside. Inside a cold case unit, it can be the whole job. An investigator opens an old file and does not expect it to speak quickly. He reads the oldest reports first. He learns the handwriting. He learns which officers were careful, which witnesses were hesitant, which leads were checked, and which ones only appear as a single line. He looks for unanswered questions that might be answerable now. He asks what the original detectives could not know. He asks what was not available to them. He asks whether a piece of evidence still exists. He asks whether the suspect, the witnesses, or the families are still alive. Then he makes a list. A cold case often begins again as a list. Find this report. Locate this person. Check this address. Review this sketch. Search for this evidence box. Call this agency. Ask the medical examiner's office what remains. Ask the property room what was retained. Ask the archive what was copied. Ask the old detective what he remembers, if he is still able to talk. The work is quiet, and much of it produces nothing. But nothing is still an answer, if it is properly recorded. It keeps the next person from walking the same empty hallway without knowing it. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Doodler case did not vanish from memory. It appeared in articles, in lists of unsolved cases, in conversations among people who remembered the fear. It lived in the recollections of investigators who had worked the file when it was young. Some said the police had once been very close. Some said the suspect had been identified but could not be charged. Some said the missing piece had always been witness cooperation. Those statements gave the case a strange public shape. It was not a mystery with no suspect at all. It was not a solved case either. It lived in between. The public heard in fragments that police may have known whom they wanted, but the court record remained empty. No trial, no conviction, no official finding. That kind of unresolved knowledge can be difficult for families and communities. It does not let grief settle. It does not let suspicion become answer. It asks people to live with a shape that may be right, but cannot be confirmed in the only way the law fully recognizes. You can imagine a retired detective in that period being asked about the case. He may remember the smell of old paper. He may remember the room where a witness sat with his hands folded. He may remember the suspect's face. He may remember the moment when it became clear that the district attorney's office did not have enough. He may remember frustration not as anger but as a tired fact. A case can become part of a detective's private life. It follows him after the assignment changes. It appears when he drives past a park. It appears when a newspaper prints another unsolved anniversary. It appears when he hears that a witness has died. He may not speak of it often, but he remembers. That remembering is not evidence. Still, it is part of how cold cases survive. Files survive because institutions keep them. Cases survive because people care enough to ask again. The paper record of the Doodler case was both valuable and limited. Every old report preserved a moment from the original investigation. But old reports also reveal the boundaries of their time. A witness statement may not include questions that a later investigator would ask. A scene report may not describe preservation in the detail expected today. An evidence log may list an item without anticipating future genetic testing. A composite sketch may show what one witness remembered, not what all witnesses agreed upon. This does not make the work meaningless, it makes it historical. You have to read it with the tools, habits, and blind spots of its period in mind. In 1974, police work leaned heavily on interviews and physical comparison. A suspect's movements might be checked through witnesses, employment, addresses, vehicles, and known associates. A person's presence in a bar might be established by someone remembering him there. A name might be developed through word of mouth. That was the method. It required trust. It required persistence. It required witnesses willing to be found. Modern investigators sometimes inherit the gaps left by that system. They cannot simply add new technology to missing evidence. They cannot test what was never saved. They cannot interview someone who died 30 years earlier. They cannot force a frightened witness from 1974 to have made a different choice. They can only work from what remains. What remained in the Doodler case was a combination of records, memory, and unanswered leads. There were victim files. There were investigative summaries. There were press clippings. There were descriptions of the suspect. There were references to survivors. There were hints that the original suspect had remained in the minds of investigators. There were also questions about whether the 5 confirmed victims represented the full pattern. That question would become more active later. In any suspected series, investigators have to decide how wide to cast the net. Cast it too narrowly, and you miss related cases. Cast it too widely, and you attach unrelated deaths to a pattern they do not belong to. Both mistakes matter. The first can hide the truth, the second can distort it. So the patient approach is to compare carefully location, date, victim profile, method of approach, last known movements, witness descriptions, evidence, rumors, differences, as well as similarities. A possible additional case is not added because it feels similar. It is considered because specific details invite comparison. And even then, the word possible must be treated with respect. Possible is not confirmed. It is a note placed gently beside the known facts. As the 1990s moved forward, forensic science changed dramatically. Genetic testing began to reshape old investigations across the country. Cases once thought unreachable were reopened because a preserved item could be tested. Names were found through biological traces that earlier detectives could not use. Later, genealogy would make the change even larger. But these advances did not help every cold case equally. Some files had preserved evidence, some did not. Some evidence had been stored well, some had degraded, some had been consumed by earlier testing. Some had been lost when agencies moved buildings, changed procedures, or cleared storage. The Doodler case faced the same question as many older cases. Was there anything left that modern science could examine? The answer was not simple in public reporting. Investigators have been careful about what they say. That caution can frustrate people who want clarity, but it also protects the work. If a case remains open, not every detail can be released. A piece of information held back may be needed to test a future confession or to measure the truth of a tip, so the public record stays incomplete by design. A cold case can be visible and still partly sealed. That is not secrecy for its own sake. It can be a way of keeping the investigation useful. At the same time, the social world around the case continued to change. More gay men could live openly than in 1974. Public attitudes had shifted, though not evenly. Police departments in many cities had begun confronting their histories with gay communities, sometimes slowly, sometimes under pressure. Community liaison work became more common. Hate crime units and cold case units developed new ways of speaking with witnesses whose earlier distrust had been earned by experience. That broader change mattered to the Doodler case because the old silence had been one of its central barriers. If a witness had once feared public ruin, perhaps he might later feel safer. If a friend had once protected someone's privacy by staying silent, perhaps he might later decide that the truth could be told without the same damage. If a relative had found papers after a death, perhaps the meaning of those papers might be clearer in a later era. The case waited for those possibilities. There is a quiet kind of courage in late testimony. It is different from speaking immediately. It may come after years of regret. It may come after a spouse has died, or a career has ended, or a family secret has already been revealed. It may come when a person is older and less afraid of consequences. It may come because the victim's name has stayed with him. Cold case investigators know this. They make appeals not only to memory, but to changed circumstances. They say, if you were afraid then, we understand. They say, if you could not speak then, perhaps you can speak now. They say, even a small detail may help. They say, you do not have to decide alone. In the Doodler case, that kind of language became essential. The old fear could not be scolded away. It had to be acknowledged. Only then could the city ask again. By the early 2000s, the Doodler case had become part of San Francisco's unresolved history. It was spoken of alongside other cases that had become larger than their files. Not because people wanted legend, because unresolved harm creates memory that does not settle. The victims' names appeared in articles. The suspect's nickname appeared in summaries. The old sketches circulated from time to time, but many people in the city were too young to remember the original fear. For them, the Doodler case was not a lived warning. It was an old mystery. That generational distance changed the case again. Distance can dull urgency. It can also create room. People who were not shaped by 1974 could ask direct questions that older witnesses had learned to avoid. Journalists could revisit archives, researchers could compare articles, police could speak publicly in a different climate. The case could be seen not only as a sequence of unsolved deaths, but as a record of how social fear affected an investigation. That wider understanding did not solve the file, but it gave the file new language. It allowed people to say that the silence itself was evidence of the time, not evidence against one person. Evidence of the conditions under which the case had to be worked. When cold case investigators return to an old file, they often begin by separating what is known from what has been repeated. That is especially important in a case with a nickname. A nickname can carry errors, it can make uncertain details sound settled. It can encourage people to repeat the most memorable part of the story, while leaving out the careful parts. So the renewed work had to ask basic questions again. Which victims are confirmed? Which cases are only possible? Which suspect descriptions came from direct witnesses? Which came from press reports? Which details were held back? Which details entered public memory later? Which witnesses were actually interviewed? Which witnesses were rumored to exist? This is not glamorous work. It is cleaning the glass before looking through it. Without that cleaning, old cases can become cloudy. The Doodler case needed that kind of care. It needed investigators and reporters willing to move slowly and to say, "We do not know," when they did not know. In the 2010s, the case began to receive renewed public attention. San Francisco police revisited it through cold case channels. Journalists returned to the archives. Community members shared old memories. The city asked again whether someone, somewhere, still knew the missing piece. This renewed attention did not mean the case had been forgotten before. It meant the conditions for asking had changed. The witnesses were older. The fear of being publicly identified as gay was different from what it had been. The public was more able to understand why men had stayed silent. The language of victim dignity had changed. The language of police accountability had changed. And the science, at least in some cold cases, had changed too. All of that made a new appeal possible. Not easy, not certain. Possible. One of the most important renewed efforts came through the release of updated suspect images. The original composite sketches had been based on descriptions from the 1970s. They showed a young man because the suspect had been young then, but decades had passed. An age-progressed image asks a quiet question, one that is different from the question asked by a young man's sketch. What would this face look like now, after 40 years of work, illness, ordinary mornings, and time? A forensic artist cannot answer that perfectly. No one can. But the image can help people look at memory from a new angle. Someone who knew a young man in 1974 might not recognize him from the old sketch anymore. Someone who knew him later, perhaps as a neighbor, co-worker, patient, relative, or friend, might recognize the older version instead. That was the purpose of the updated images. They were not proof. They were invitations. They asked the public to look again, not with panic, but with care. The release of those images also showed how cold casework had changed. In the 1970s, investigators were asking people to remember a man they might have seen days or weeks earlier. In the 2010s, investigators were asking people to connect lives across decades. The suspect, if still alive, would no longer be a young man. He would be older, perhaps retired, perhaps living quietly, perhaps known to people who had no idea that police had once connected him to one of San Francisco's most painful unsolved cases. That is a strange kind of distance. A person can become old, while an old file stays the same age. The reports still say 1974. The sketches still show a young face. The victims remained fixed at the ages they were when their files began. But the living keep changing. Detectives had to account for that. They had to ask not only, who was this man then? They had to ask, who might know him now? The renewed appeals also increased the reward money. San Francisco police and city officials eventually offered a reward in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for information leading to an arrest and conviction. That detail matters, not because money can replace conscience, but because rewards can move old information. Someone may have carried a memory for years and considered it too small. Someone may have heard a family story and never thought it was worth calling in. Someone may have known the suspect by a nickname, an address, or a habit, but doubted it would help. A reward can make people reconsider. It can make a small detail feel worth the effort of speaking. It can also bring mistaken tips, and detectives know that. A larger reward can widen the circle, but it also increases the work of sorting truth from guesswork. So the renewed investigation did not become simple. It became more active and more complicated. A tip in an old case has to be handled carefully. The caller may be sincere and wrong. The caller may be frightened and right. The caller may have heard something secondhand. The caller may be trying to settle an old personal score. The caller may be offering one piece that only makes sense beside another piece hidden somewhere else in the file. Detectives cannot know at first, so they listen. They ask when the memory began. They ask how the caller knows the information. They ask whether the caller saw something personally or heard it from another person. They ask whether there are documents, photographs, letters, diaries, drawings, or names that can be checked. Then they compare. Comparison is the old work, returning in a newer room. A new tip is placed beside old statements. An old sketch is placed beside a new recollection. A name is checked against addresses, ages, movements, and known connections. The pace is still patient, only the tools have changed. The newer San Francisco police appeals asked for people who had lived in very specific worlds to think back. Former bar patrons, former bartenders, friends of victims, people who were in the Castro, Polk Street, the Tenderloin, Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, or Lincoln Park in the mid-1970s. People who remembered a young black man who drew portraits, offered sketches, or used art to begin conversation. People who had survived an encounter but never reported it. People who had been told a story in confidence. People who had once stayed silent because silence felt safer. The appeals were careful, because they had to be. They needed to say, "We know why you may not have come forward then." They needed to say, "The world is different now, though not perfect." They needed to say, "Your name and your life will be treated with respect." They needed to say, "Even a small detail may matter." That language was not decoration. It was part of the investigation. If fear was one of the reasons evidence had remained hidden, then trust had to become one of the tools used to search for it. Journalists also became part of the renewed attention. Reporters from San Francisco looked back through archives, spoke with investigators, and placed the case in the wider history of the city. Their work did not replace police work. It gave the public a way to understand why the case had remained unresolved for so long. A good cold case reporter does something similar to a cold case detective. They separate rumor from record. They ask what was known then. They ask what can be said now. They return to old articles, old addresses, old names, and old public statements. They try to see whether a detail has grown in the telling. They try to keep the victims from becoming only symbols. In the Doodler case, that mattered because the nickname could easily overtake the people. A reporter returning to the file had to keep saying the names: Gerald Kavanaugh, Joseph Stevens, Klaus Chrisman, Frederick Kappen, Harold Goldberg. The names slow the story down. They remind you that the file is not a puzzle for curiosity alone. It is a record of lives interrupted and of a city that did not yet know how to protect all of its people equally. The renewed reporting also helped explain the old witness problem in clearer terms. In earlier decades, some summaries had made it sound simple. Witnesses would not testify. The case could not be prosecuted. But the deeper story was not simple at all. Those witnesses lived in a time when being publicly connected to a gay murder investigation could alter an entire life. A diplomat might face professional consequences. An entertainer might face public scandal. A man with family obligations might fear being exposed to people who did not know the truth of his private life. A survivor might fear being blamed for where he had been or whom he had trusted. These fears were not excuses. They were part of the landscape. By revisiting that landscape, newer investigators and reporters could help people understand that the Doodler case was not only unsolved because someone failed to ask questions, it was unsolved because some answers were trapped inside a world that punished people for giving them. That is a hard thing to hold. But holding it honestly is better than making the past seem cleaner than it was. The newer appeals also raised the possibility that the official list of victims might not tell the whole story. This has to be approached slowly. In an old suspected series, the temptation is to expand the list whenever a case feels similar, but feeling similar is not enough. Investigators have to ask whether the same pattern is present in ways that can be supported. They look at location, they look at time, they look at victim profile, they look at the last known circumstances. They look for the sketchpad detail or for an approach that resembles it. They look for a suspect description. They look for investigative notes from the period. They also look for differences. A difference can be just as important as a similarity. If a case does not fit, forcing it into the pattern does harm. It can mislead the public. It can distort the memory of the victim. It can pull detectives away from more useful work. So the word possible must stay soft. Possible does not mean confirmed. It means this file deserves careful comparison. One name that later received renewed public attention was Warren Andrews. He was attacked near Land's End in April of 1975 in the western part of San Francisco, not far from the parkland and shoreline geography that appears again and again in the Doodler files. He survived for a time and later died from his injuries. For many years, his case sat near the edge of the larger story. Later investigators and reporters looked at it again, because the place, the time, and the circumstances invited comparison. That does not make the work automatic. It makes it necessary. A cold case detective looking at Warren Andrews would ask whether the same suspect could be connected. Was there a witness description? Was there a social approach? Was there a reason to link the case beyond geography? What did the original reports say? What did later summaries add? What was known and what was assumed? These are the questions that keep a file honest. They do not let the shape of a famous case swallow every nearby tragedy. They ask each file to speak in its own voice. Other names have also been examined by journalists and investigators over the years. Some may belong to the pattern. Some may not. Some may never be clear. That is part of the difficulty of cold casework. The farther you move from the original investigation, the more you rely on what was preserved. If a report is thin, it stays thin. If a witness died, his memory cannot be recovered. If evidence was not saved, science cannot create it from air. If a location changed, the old physical context may be gone. Still, comparison can sometimes reveal something. A patrol note may place a similar description in the same area. An old newspaper article may mention a detail not repeated elsewhere. A surviving friend may remember that the victim had spoken of a man who drew. A hospital record may preserve a statement that investigators did not fully connect at the time. The work is not only to find new things, it is to read old things with older eyes. This is why archives matter. An archive is not only a room with boxes, it is a second chance for questions. In a case like the Doodler, the archive may include police reports, coroner records, evidence logs, dispatch notes, newspaper clippings, letters from the public, sketches, internal memos, and lists of people to contact. Each item carries its own limits. A newspaper clipping may contain errors. A police summary may omit context. A witness statement may preserve memory from a single angle. An evidence log may tell you that an item existed, but not whether it still exists. The cold case investigator has to read with patience. You do not trust everything equally. You do not discard everything either. You let each document show what it can show. Then you look for where one document touches another. That touching is where movement can begin. In the renewed investigation, detectives also had to consider whether the original suspect was still alive. Public reporting has suggested that police maintained interest in a person from the original investigation. They have also been careful about naming him. That care matters. Without charges and without a conviction, a person cannot be publicly treated as guilty simply because a file contains suspicion. The law protects that boundary. It can feel frustrating in an unsolved case, but it is essential. A cold case is not helped by careless accusation. It is helped by evidence. So investigators spoke in measured terms. They released sketches. They asked for tips. They described the suspect's approximate age in the 1970s, his general appearance, and the behavior associated with the sketchpad. They did not simply name a person and let public attention do the rest. That restraint is part of patient work. It keeps the focus on what can still be proven. The updated images also asked another kind of question. Could someone in a family recognize a pattern from the past? A relative might remember a young man who drew constantly. A sibling might remember police contact in the 1970s. A former partner might remember a sudden move, a period of fear, or a hidden collection of sketches. A friend might remember that he stopped going to certain bars after the case became public. A coworker might remember a conversation about San Francisco that seemed odd only in hindsight. None of these memories would solve the case alone, but they could give detectives a path. They could lead to records. They could lead to a name used in a bar. They could lead to an address. They could lead to another witness. In cold case work, the most valuable tip is not always the most dramatic one. Sometimes it is the tip that gives investigators one checkable fact: a date, a former address, a workplace, a car, a nickname, a drawing signed with initials. A small thing that can be held. The case's renewed visibility also changed how people spoke about the victims. Earlier reporting sometimes reflected the limitations and prejudices of its time. Later reporting could do more. It could describe the victims as men with lives, work, histories, and communities. It could explain why gay men in the 1970s might have met in bars, parks, and informal spaces. It could avoid treating those spaces as suspicious in themselves. It could say plainly that the danger came from the person who exploited trust, not from the victim's need for connection. That change in language matters. Language shapes whether people feel safe helping. If a community hears itself described with contempt, it will not bring its memories forward. If a community hears respect, it may open a little. The Doodler case needed that opening. It had needed it from the beginning. By the early 2020s, the case had become newly visible again. Police appeals, updated sketches, podcasts, newspaper projects, and public discussions brought the old file into a different kind of light. The city was no longer the San Francisco of 1974. The Castro had become internationally known. The legal and social standing of gay people had changed in ways that earlier witnesses may not have imagined. At the same time, the old fear was not something that could simply be erased by later progress. People who had been afraid then had made decisions under the pressure of then. A later world can understand those decisions, but it cannot undo their consequences. That is the quiet sadness running through the Doodler investigation. The case may have needed people to speak before the world had made speaking safe. The renewed appeals did not produce a public resolution. They produced movement of another kind. A reward increased, images circulated, tips arrived, investigators reconsidered related cases, journalists reconstructed timelines. The names of the victims were spoken again. People who had once been young in San Francisco were asked to reach back across nearly half a century. Some may have called, some may have hesitated, some may have opened boxes, looked at old photographs and wondered whether a face in the background mattered. Some may have decided that a memory was too uncertain. Some may have decided that silence had lasted long enough. The public does not see all of that. In an open case, much of the movement happens behind a closed door. A detective takes a call, a note is added, a name is checked, a file is pulled, a comparison is made, then the public hears nothing, because there may be nothing ready to say. That silence can feel like stillness. It is not always still. Sometimes, in a cold case, the most active work looks like a single line added to an old page. A detective writes, "Cold witness, no answer," and then tries again a week later. Another detective checks whether an evidence envelope still exists and waits for a property room response. A journalist asks for one more archive box and finds the same clipping, folded in a different way. These are not dramatic moments. They are the small movements that keep an old case from becoming only a story. In the Doodler investigation, the renewed attention created exactly that kind of movement. It asked the city to look back at specific years, specific streets, specific rooms, and specific faces. It asked people to remember San Francisco as it was, not as it later became. The official appeals in the newer era were careful about one thing. They did not ask the public to solve a legend. They asked for information. A name used in a bar, a former address, a drawing kept in a drawer, a memory of someone who matched the sketch and who spoke about Ocean Beach, Golden Gate Park, or Lincoln Park. A recollection of a man who was artistic, young, and present in the right social places during 1974 and 1975. That kind of request is narrow, but it is also wide enough for one person to step through. The increase in reward money was part of that effort. By the early 2020s, public reports described a reward of $200,000 for information leading to an arrest and conviction. That amount did not change the old evidence by itself, but it changed the invitation. It told people that the city still considered the case open. It told people that a memory from decades earlier might still matter. It also told any reluctant witness or friend of a witness that the investigation had not been left behind in a forgotten cabinet. The drawer had been opened again, the pages had been read again, the names had been spoken again. The renewed sketches carried the same message in another form. The younger face, drawn from old witness descriptions, remained important because it belonged to the time of the crimes. The age-progressed image asked a different question, one shaped by the long passage of years. Who might this man have become? Who might have known him as an older neighbor, co-worker, relative, patient, church member, or quiet acquaintance? Who might have seen an old sketch and felt a small discomfort, not certainty, but recognition? Cold case investigators often work in that space between discomfort and certainty. They do not ask the feeling to prove the case. They ask the feeling to lead towards something that can be checked. A person might say, "I knew someone who drew portraits in bars." Another might say, "I remember a man who stopped visiting San Francisco suddenly." Another might say, "My brother was questioned by police around that time, and the family never spoke of it." Another might say, "I kept a drawing for years and never knew why it troubled me." Each of these statements would still need to be examined. Each could be wrong. Each could also contain one small fact that touches the older file. That is how old investigations move late in their lives. Not by sweeping certainty, by contact, one detail touching another. One name touching a date, one memory touching a place. The possibility of additional victims became part of the renewed work, but it remained careful. Warren Andrews, attacked near Land's End in April of 1975, drew attention because of the location and timing. Land's End sits near the western rim of San Francisco, where trails, trees, cliffs, and the ocean create another place that can feel public and secluded at once. It was close to the geography that appeared so often in the confirmed files. That made comparison reasonable. It did not make conclusion automatic. Investigators had to ask what could actually be supported. They had to look for a witness description, a method of approach, a social connection, and any old note that might point toward the same suspect. Without those, geography alone could not carry the weight. This is where cold case work shows its humility. It does not say this must be connected, because the map feels right. It says this may be connected, if the facts allow it. That difference protects the truth. It protects the confirmed victims from being blurred into a larger myth. It protects other victims from having their own stories absorbed into the wrong pattern. And it protects the investigation from becoming wider than the evidence can bear. The Doodler case already had enough uncertainty. It did not need careless certainty added to it. So the official center of the case remained the 5 confirmed names. Gerald Kavanaugh, found near Ocean Beach in January of 1974. Joseph Stevens, known as Jay, found near Spreckles Lake in Golden Gate Park in June of 1974. Klaus Christmann, found near Ocean Beach in July of 1974. Frederick Kappin, found in the western park and shoreline geography of San Francisco in May of 1975. Harold Gullberg, found near the Lincoln Park area in June of 1975. 5 names placed carefully in order. 5 files, each with its own timeline. 5 lives, each larger than the case that now holds them. It can be tempting, after so many years, to speak of them mainly as evidence. But a calm reading of the file has to resist that. Gerald Kavanagh was not simply the first point on a map. Joseph Stevens was not simply the second file that changed the shape of the first. Klaus Chrisman was not simply the return to Ocean Beach. Frederick Kappan was not simply the next sign that the pattern had continued. Harold Gullberg was not simply the fifth name. They were men who lived in the city, or came to it, or passed through it, with private histories that no police report can fully hold. A case file records what the investigation needs. It does not record everything a person was. It may note an address, but not the sound of a person's laugh. It may note an occupation, but not how tired he was at the end of a day. It may note a last known movement, but not the long chain of choices and hopes that brought him there. It may note friends, habits, belongings, and paperwork. It cannot hold the whole human life. That is why, at the end of a long unsolved case, the names need to be said plainly, not as clues. As people, the investigators carried those names in a different way. For them, each name came with tasks. Find the last witness, check the last address, review the last known sighting, compare the suspect description, return to the bar, return to the park, return to the shoreline. Ask again, then ask again differently. The rhythm became almost liturgical, a set of repeated actions performed because there was no other honest way forward. The deepest frustration was not that detectives had no suspect at all. It was that suspicion seemed to arrive before proof. That is a hard order for an investigation. If proof comes first, a case can move. If suspicion comes first, the case may begin to circle one person without having enough to reach court. The Doodler file appears to have lived in that circle for decades. Police believed they had identified a likely suspect. They questioned him. They compared him with witness accounts. They still did not have enough for charges. For the district attorney, the question was never only, do detectives believe this? The question was, can this be proved in a public courtroom? Can the witnesses testify? Can the identification survive challenge? Can the timeline hold? Can physical evidence support the claim? Can the case meet the standard required by law? Those questions are not obstacles placed in the path of justice for no reason. They are part of justice itself. They protect people from being convicted on rumor, fear, or resemblance. But in the Doodler case, they also meant that a painful suspicion could remain legally unresolved. The witnesses who may have known the most were caught in the hardest position. They had survived. They may have been able to recognize the man. But public testimony could have exposed parts of their lives that the world of that time did not protect. A courtroom could have turned survival into scrutiny. A newspaper could have turned a private life into a public label. A question from an attorney could have opened doors the witness had spent years holding shut. So some did not testify, and because they did not testify, the case could not become what investigators hoped it might become. It is easy, from far away, to wish they had chosen differently. But a patient retelling has to stay close to the time. In 1974, openness could cost a person work, family, safety, and standing. It could change how landlords, employers, colleagues, and relatives treated him. It could make a survivor feel judged for being in the very place where he had almost been lost. That kind of fear is not a small detail, it is a structural fact of the case. It shaped the evidence. It shaped the silence. It shaped the outcome. This is why the Doodler investigation belongs not only to the history of homicide work, but to the history of trust. If a community has been taught that police attention is dangerous, then police cannot simply arrive and expect memories to open. If a witness has been taught that public truth can ruin him, then a subpoena is not only a legal paper. It is a threat to the life he has built. If a city wants answers later, it has to reckon with what made answers so difficult earlier. The Doodler case asks that of San Francisco. Quietly but steadily, the case also asks something of modern listeners. It asks you to understand evidence as more than objects. Evidence can be a page in a file. Yes. It can be a sketch, a statement, a timeline, an item preserved in storage. But evidence can also be a person deciding whether the truth is safe enough to say aloud. If the world makes that decision dangerous, then the evidence may never arrive. That is not a mystery in the usual sense. It is a consequence, and the Doodler case is full of consequences. The original evidence was limited by the tools of its time. The witness evidence was limited by fear. The public evidence was limited by what police could safely release. The prosecutable evidence was limited by what could be carried into court. Each limit narrowed the path. Together they made an investigation that could come close and still not arrive. That is the shape of this cold case. Nearness without resolution, knowledge without verdict, memory without proof. And yet, the file staying open matters. It means that the victims have not been formally set aside. It means that a tip can still be received. It means that a family member, a former neighbor, or an old acquaintance can still decide to speak. It means that if an evidence item remains, and if science can test it, there may still be work to do. It means that the question has not been dismissed simply because it is old. Some cases are solved after decades because one preserved trace survives. Some are solved because one person finally talks. Some are solved because a detective rereads an old report and notices what everyone else passed over. The Doodler case has not had that final movement, but it still has the possibility of one. You can imagine the file now in a quieter room than the rooms where it began. The paper is older. The ink has settled. Some names in the reports belong to people who are gone. Some locations have changed beyond recognition. Some bars have closed, been renamed, or turned into something else entirely. But the western edge of the city is still there. Ocean Beach is still there. Golden Gate Park is still there. Lincoln Park is still there. The fog still comes in. The surf still folds itself against the sand. If you walk those places today, you are not walking through the same San Francisco, but you are walking through a city that remembers in layers. Under the present streets are the old routes. Under the present names are the older signs. Under the ordinary sound of traffic is the quiet knowledge that people once moved through these spaces carefully, hoping to be seen by the right people and unseen by the wrong ones. That is part of the case too. The city's geography did not harm anyone by itself, but it offered places where trust could be tested. It offered edges, shadows, meetings, and departures. Investigators had to read those places like pages. The final unanswered questions remain simple. Who exactly was the man with the sketchpad? Was the suspect identified by police truly the Doodler? Were there other victims beyond the 5 confirmed files? Did someone keep a drawing? Did someone hear a confession or a near confession and not understand what it meant? Did a witness carry the right memory for decades, waiting for a safer time to speak? These questions do not need to be sharpened into drama. They are sharp enough already. There is also the question of what justice can mean after so much time. If a suspect is dead, a courtroom may never answer. If witnesses are gone, testimony may never be recovered. If evidence was lost, science may have no place to begin. But even then, naming the truth matters. A confirmed answer would matter to the victims' families. It would matter to the community that lived through the fear. It would matter to the investigators who held the case in memory. It would matter because a life does not stop mattering when a case grows old. The long work of the Doodler case shows how patient investigation can be both disciplined and deeply human. Detectives gathered what they could. Witnesses gave what they felt safe enough to give. Reporters later returned to the record. Cold case investigators asked the public to look again. Each generation inherited the same file, but not the same city. And each generation had to decide whether to keep asking. So far, the answer has been yes. That is not the same as a solution, but it is not nothing. It is a form of care. It is a refusal to let fear be the final author of the record. It is a way of saying that Gerald Kavanaugh, Joseph Stevens, Klaus Christmann, Frederick Kappen, and Harold Goldberg are still held in the city's memory. Not perfectly, not completely, but held. As the story settles, the sketchpad remains one of the strangest and quietest details. A simple object, paper, a pencil, an offer to draw. Something that might have seemed gentle across a small table in a bar. Something that gave the case its name but not its answer. For investigators, that detail became a path into memory. For the public, it became a phrase. For the victims, it may have been only one brief moment in an ordinary night. Old cases often end, for the listener, before they end for the people assigned to them. The video stops. The room grows quiet. The file, somewhere, remains open. A detective may still receive a call, a record may still be checked, a family member may still recognize an old face. A person who has waited many years may still decide that now is the time. And if that happens, the movement will probably be small at first. Not a dramatic break, not a sudden clearing of every fogged window, just one detail, newly placed, one statement finally given, one old uncertainty becoming a little more solid. That is how patient answers often arrive, slowly, carefully, almost softly. For now, the Doodler case remains between evidence and memory. It is close enough to feel shaped and distant enough to resist being held. It belongs to the ocean roads, the park paths, the old bars, the witnesses who feared exposure, and the investigators who learned that knowing and proving are not the same thing. It belongs, most of all, to the 5 men whose names remain at the center. The file is still open, the questions are still there, the water moves in and out, and somewhere perhaps one ordinary detail is still waiting to be remembered.